Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects Podcast. Super excited today to be, as always, joined by my co-host. But before I introduce him, I got to brag on him just a little bit because he's been all over the industry press over the last week or so with some great work that him and the folks at NB Consult have been doing around Zero Trust and Zero Trust Framework. So Nick, man, it's always good to see we have lives outside of the podcast, right? And so it's always cool when that type of stuff pops up. But congrats on all the hard work. I know you guys have been working on that for a good while now. Maybe we can talk a little bit about it, not to take away from our guest anyway. But joined as always by Mr. Nicholas Blank in cold Cape Town.
Thank you, Chris. Stop! No, don't stop. Yeah, you're right. It was more than a year's worth of labor of love and so much wrestling with this topic of how do we make Zero Trust available as a security framework to the normal human being. And the normal human being is basically anyone in a leadership position who has to understand what security is and what are you paying for. And Robby, who I'll introduce in a second, and I think we share a very pragmatic view on security and on life, that what we do might be very not difficult, but it's fairly technical, and those technicalities shouldn't stop someone who wants to make a responsible decision for understanding what they're actually paying for. So with that, I want to introduce a longtime friend of mine, Robby Pedrica, and one of the things, and I have to brag on Robby here for a second, is that I've known Robby for decades to fearlessly strive to do the right thing for the right reasons in an industry where it's so easy to create FUD and overcharge for services, especially when it gets to anything from a consultative or a security nature. And so with that, Robby, welcome to the show.
Nicholas, Chris, thank you very much. That's incredibly gracious of you. But you actually spot on the topic. I think our industry can be a little bit like a shark tank at times. And I think having the fortitude to try and do the best for the customer, for the client, that's the right thing to do. So thank you for having me on today.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I want to drill into that for a second, Robby, and let's understand your why. And as a technical person myself, and being surrounded by technical folks who want to do the right things by our customers as opposed to just doing a drive-by sale, as it were, tell us a little bit of why do you care?
I think partially it's because my work life grew up in an open source environment, and I think there is that sort of sense of wanting to help others, a sense of community, and I think that translates into my business life directly. And also, I will say, being more technical means that is the area that I focus on more than, for example, business profit. So I think that's sort of where that comes from.
I think it's fair to say that as responsible adults ourselves, we're not just going to altruistically throw profit into the wind, because ultimately we need to eat and to pay salaries. However, on the other side of the coin, I've also known you as a champion for open source technologies, even though you are very enterprise aware and that you deal in enterprise. Can you talk to us about why you would do open source technologies? And this is everything from what you're running on your desktop through to running not only mature SOC SIEM and also SOARs for customers. I mean, there's a massive divide in there. Talk to us about, why open source, and does open source actually fit into the enterprise? When you look at the large enterprise vendors who come along with an XDR offering, as an example, that does a defense at every possible endpoint, ties it together with AI, and then spits together a an event to an analyst to have a look at with some pre-correlation. I mean, obviously that needs lots of compute and it's very expensive, but how does open source even compete in that type of arena against the large corporate with seemingly unlimited budgets in the enterprise?
I think I'll start off by saying that open source has an unusual view on the software world, and that comes from that community aspect where you've got, for lack of a better word, Tom, Dick, and Harry sort of beavering away in their garage, generating some piece of software that may or may not be useful to others. But I think with input from companies like IBM in the early 2000s and Red Hat in the mid 2000s, they've sort of given open source a more enterprise sheen, and suitably so. I think open source has grown up, and we've seen especially commercial companies embracing open source. And if I say the word Microsoft, you might nod your head in agreement.
Yeah.
So I think certainly at this point in time, and for the last decade, open source has grown up. And in the commercial world, we see a lot of open source componentry, especially being used as the building blocks to commercial output. So definitely, I don't think there's any lack there at the moment. There's obviously an issue when it comes to the code quality, because there's no single company to check on the code quality of open source projects. That has changed in recent years as well, along with the security aspects of open source software, where a number of commercial companies have realized that there's a problem here. There's perhaps a particular library that is coded by one single guy that's used across the entire planet. It's an important library. So some companies have gotten together, they've created funds to support open source developers, not only in the coding practices, coding policies, etc., but also for the security aspect of their software. They don't have the funds to employ third parties to check their software. So that sort of gives open source a stepping stone into the enterprise. And if we look at the enterprise, a lot of enterprises and companies are using open source. Sometimes they know it, and sometimes they don't. But it is everywhere. And I think we have to accept that. We have to work with it as organizations, enterprises, and we need to catalog it in our companies, and like we do with anything else, asset management-wise, and then see, is this something that's for us? Is it useful? Is it secure? Does it have support? You know, all the standard organizational policy things that we need to follow. So yep, I'll mention one particular open source project you might know it, called OpenSSL. And OpenSSL is probably an open source library that's used the most across the world, and the number of installations is numbered in the hundreds of millions. A couple of years ago, they had a critical vulnerability that was regarded, as quite bad. And I think at that point, a number of commercial companies realized that we're depending on the software. So we need to actually contribute to this open source project and others to make sure that the software that we depend on works well and is secure.
I think I just had like shivers when I heard that, because I was reminded of the Log4j vulnerability from like 18 months ago as well, which is very similar, right? Is a lot of organizations didn't even know that they had Log4j being used because it was bundled into commercial offerings. And it kind of begs the question is, if you take something that is open source and freely available and you commercialize it into your own offering, to make it more appealing to the masses, right? Because now it's technically it's a commercial offering. Well, you're still relying on the developers and the code management and lifecycle management of the project itself, which I think, again, in many ways it's either a good thing or a bad thing, right? I know a lot of folks love the fact that open source projects, because the source is open, can be audited by anyone, right? And again, bugs and vulnerabilities can be found by anyone, but it just takes the motive behind the person finding it, right? If that person is finding it for personal gain, or for the better of the community, because they're either going to disclose it or they're not, right? They're going to sell it on. So it's a very fascinating conversation, and you can, depending on which side of the fence you sit, right, you could go pretty deep into on either side.
I'll be honest with you, I'm extremely pragmatic about this subject. I understand the organizational concerns with regards to using open source software. I think anyone in enterprise and even SME needs to understand those concerns. But I don't think those concerns only apply to open source software. Certainly some of them will apply to commercial software as well. So, I think open source software is here. We use it, and we need to treat it as an enterprise product, and we need to apply exactly the same considerations to it as we do commercial software.
And I think the thing is that it extends beyond. For a lot of folks, when they think open source software, they think of Linux. And that's like their only point of reference that they have, right? Is, well, I'm going to download this SUSE thing or whatever it's called, and I'm going to install that's. And to them, they're like, well, no, we won't do that. We want Windows. But as you said, it can be as small as just a library used in, a complete bundling of some other commercial platform that you don't even know about.
Yeah, and Nicholas, further to your question with regards to the security components in open source software, things like XDR, MDR, EDR, etc. In that area, we tend to find more dual licensing type of projects. If we look at companies like CrowdSec and Sandfly Security, where they have dual commercial and community versions of their software. And I think that's a very niche specialist area, and we find more that commercial companies are driving that in the open source space. Yes, there's been projects like Packet Fence for NACs around for decades already, but especially when it comes to newer technologies, I'll just call them the DRs, because there's so many of them these days. It's typically commercial companies that are driving it in the open source space, which is actually very, very interesting. And I think it gives you a sense of what commercial companies think of open source these days. I think they realize that it's come of age and that it's something that they need to embrace.
Robby, I want to stay on this point for a second, and I enjoy reading your blog, and we'll add your blog to the show notes so that folks can see what we're talking about. And on one of your blog posts is IT security for the small business. And in there, you've got 13 steps that start with the very much like the NIST framework. Let's start with a digital inventory of what you have, because I know very few customers actually know what they have. And it ends off with vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. Now, I could argue that if I go to, and I'm just going to throw 3 vendors out here currently in the Magic Quadrant for XDR. So if I pick on a Microsoft, a CrowdStrike, and a Trend Micro, for example, I could get 13 tools from the same vendor with one or few consoles, and arguably the magic single pane of glass that we've been promised by the industry for, 3 decades, but never seem to get to. If you look at a company who says, I want to embrace open source and community offerings very seriously, and I want to have best of breed, for me, this is a little bit of the same territory where I have one brand of AV on my endpoint, I manage my firewall, something else, I might still do some kind of web inspection with something else. And very quickly in an enterprise scenario, we can get to between 5 and 10 different vendors, all best of breed, so to speak. And the issue for me there is that you've got huge management overhead because you've got 5 or 10 different consoles, no integrated log streams. And if you're doing any type of follow a lateral move from, say, a directory service over to a file system to a workstation, you've got all these different types of logs to look at. So I'm a huge advocate personally for trying to simplify things. And with that, from a commercial point of view, it's very easy for me to say, go with a single XDR vendor, because you basically have in theory, you have a single console, right? But looking at your article, and it's a fantastic article, by the way, because it really gives companies a place of a way to start and steps to follow, very pragmatic steps to follow. But are they looking at 13 different vendors? How would you do security of an open source nature without having 13 different consoles?
So let me start at the small business, because I think that's probably the most difficult area. You're dealing with companies that might be mom and pop shops, small budgets, and no support, no IT support. So they are absolutely dependent on their IT partners and their IT support to advise them on what they should do in terms of security, and then implement it.
Yeah.
So it's extremely difficult when you're working with a limited budget, and that's where open source can play a very pivotal part in those smaller companies. So the trick here is to have the skill in your IT support partner to actually implement those and actually give you business value, in that area. We find most IT support, or what we'll call desktop support companies, and I don't mean any offense here, do not have the appropriate skill to progress beyond simple IT solutions and the desktop and maybe entry-level server work. So it's absolutely critical that smaller companies get IT support partners that have the skill to advise them on what they should be looking at and be implementing it within their cost envelope. As we move up the scale and the capability of organizations improves, the IT capability, then I think you probably tend to look more at commercial solutions with a mix of open source included. And I'll give an example. You might go for a commercial vendor in terms of your primary security functions, for example, firewalling, security, logging, analytics, etc. But then you might be using Elasticsearch or Graylog or something like that on the back end to aggregate logs from a variety of different products, and then presenting it to you in a single pane for viewing purposes. That's one of the areas where open source has done very, very well, is log aggregation, log analytics, etc. There's quite a lot of products that provide that kind of feature set. So it's difficult from a commercial vendor point of view, because very few commercial vendors offer the entire menu of security point products. Okay, I'll mention, for example, perhaps companies like Palo Alto and Fortinet that are leading that group of vendors in terms of the broadness of their product offering, but certainly it's few and far between. So the concept of a single pane of glass is not attainable. I've yet to see it. It's extremely difficult to do, because you are going to end up with a number of vendors in your environment. And I think it's how you manage your expectations for what you want as a customer, and what the vendors are able to give you in return is going to determine what the outcome is. But as I said, don't discount open source software in this environment, because there are a lot of options where you have security aggregation, especially that you need to do, that open source can help in those areas.
Chris, let me throw this question over to you, since you are security qualified and you went through a lot of work to become a CISSP. If you had to think about risk profiles, commercial software and open source, I think with the advent of, well, bear in mind we had an episode around Exchange Server, Swiss cheese or fine wine. We've had firewall vendors in the news lately, or commercial firewall vendors for being the source of vulnerabilities based on vulnerabilities that are found in their VPN platforms. In your mind, is there such a large divide between open source and commercial software? If we think of the kind of injection attacks we've had with SolarWinds over the last few years, where do you stand?
I think fundamentally the risk profiles and the way you manage those things, it's very similar, right? You can't, just as you can't expect to deploy Exchange Server and never patch it, you can't do that with any open source thing either, right? Now, you may find that the one person operation open source binary that you're using for something, that person may take a little longer to come around with from a disclosure and to a patch, to a release of that patch, than what Microsoft may, if someone discloses something to them, because Microsoft will pay a bug bounty and all of these other things. So they obviously have a lot more eyes on their code, right? So there's obviously that risk to think about. If something goes wrong, how quickly can we get support for it? Not only in terms of the vendor who installed it to come back in and patch it, right? And specifically, if you're in a small environment and maybe you're running some open source mail server or something like that, and you need specialist skill to come in and manage it. So I think that's important to think about, right? Is that the speed to resolution for things like updates and patching, and how quickly the vendor may come out. Now, is it a good idea to go with an open source product that no one has updated in the last 6 years? Well, probably not, right? But you can make that decision. Again, that's the same decision as would you go and install software where the vendor is now defunct? Like, you're not going to get support from that either, right? So I think you need to use the same logic and the same frameworks when you make the decisions around, is this thing right for my business? It doesn't matter if the software is open source or commercial. You need to look at it from the same perspective and make sure that it ticks the same boxes, right? Is it something that we absolutely require across the business? Or is it a nice to have thing that everyone's talking about, right? Let's see what the requirements are. Does it meet all of our requirements? How does it sit as far as, I don't know, the other compliance things and supportability and all of those other frameworks and controls that you need to apply. And if you can tick them off for either or, then obviously there's not as much of a big deal. I definitely think we are seeing, certainly, you mentioned Greylog, Robby. I think that's one you come across fairly often in the enterprise, right? It's before SIEM was the thing that it is now. Like, there were a lot of organizations that kind of used Greylog. I mean, it sort of set the standard for a long, long time. And I think also, like, any of these open source projects are, one check away from becoming the next startup, right? Because as soon as they get the funding, all of a sudden it's no longer an open source project and it's a startup, and these guys, you know what I mean? So I think a lot of things that we see as these sort of disruptive products started as an open source project before they were able to get their funding through. So I really don't think anyone should be discriminating on stuff based purely on whether the fact that it's open source or not. I think if you apply the same logic to any vendor decision that you would make or software selection decision that you make, I think you'll get to the right answer regardless. Hopefully that kind of mumbling answers the question that you...
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
Robby?
Chris, I'll add on to that, and for those listeners and viewers who don't understand the sort of development model for mainstream open source, there's a few major commercial open source companies around the world. For example, SUSE and Red Hat, and it sounds like opposites meeting there, open source and commercial. But that's essentially what they are. And if you take a company like Red Hat, the actual product, Red Hat Enterprise Linux Server, has approximately 11,000 packages in the operating system. And Red Hat's promise to customers that make use of their product is that they will support each and every one of those packages in their product. And that means behind the scenes, Red Hat, SUSE, and other companies, commercial companies, are making the effort to track all those individual products, to track the security aspects and the vulnerabilities and the statuses of those projects, because they are including those projects in their commercial product. So it's to their benefit to make sure that these products survive, and not only survive, but survive well and are secure. So yes, there is a lot of infrastructure, a lot of force, a lot of commercial power behind open source, mainstream open source, that is.
That's really good information. And I imagine, so who's the crowd that does that for Ubuntu? It's Canonical, is that what they're called?
Correct.
Yeah. So similar thing there, right? So that's a very good point, is that if you have the support and the backing of that type of project, right, it makes sense. What are you afraid of ultimately then, right? And when you think about, again, the fact, so my favorite password manager, and I guess we should do an episode at some point to talk about the stuff that we like to use, right, Nick? Because I know, we have our things that we like to use. My password manager that I like to use is a password manager called Bitwarden, and I've been using it for a little while now, and I really like Bitwarden. For one, they have a free version, but they also have like a paid version that costs like $10 a year or something. So it's actually really not that bad to be able to support the project. But their stuff it's all open source, right? So if you worry about the fact that you don't actually know what's going on under the covers of your password manager, well, that seems like an obvious thing, is to use something that's open source, because, people are going to be able to take a peek at the code, and they know that if the developers say the encryption algorithms are doing this thing, well, it can be verified. It's not just hidden in some black box that you don't actually know what's happening, right? Other people, again, would argue, well, if it's open, then you can find the exploits more easily. I think there's always going to be those two sort of conflicting or argue both sides of the argument, right? It depends on what you feel more comfortable with in your sort of threat model, and how you...
Let me give you an answer to that, and then I'll pose a question to Robby very much in this vein. And I like using a commercial product for my password vault, and that's because I'm able to hold someone to account if something goes wrong. So I'm buying for something, I'm buying a service for something, and that means that as long as myself and the vendor agree on the terms and conditions, I'm giving them money and they're owning my risk, right? And go on, Robby.
So I would suggest that that's not a guarantee, and I think the recent LastPass hack, and I will say this quite clearly, LastPass is bumbling dealing with the whole saga, has been a point demonstrating that even commercial companies can struggle with this aspect of disclosure, and solving these types of security issues. I think commercially, LastPass has made some problems for themselves, and you can hear in the industry that a lot of people are looking for alternative solutions. So yeah, I think it's company specific, and whether it's open source, commercial, I don't think it matters. There's open source companies that have made a mess of disclosures in the past as well. And I think it's up to the specific company how they deal with security disclosures, and whether they take their clients into their confidence. Whether I'm paying for a product or not, I want to feel part of the product, and I want to feel that the vendor has my interests in their mind, and it can go either way.
I'm chomping at the bit to jump into that one, because having dealt with highly regulated customers, people who run nuclear reactors and things that are of a nature that need to be highly regulated, when we've worked with them, if there wasn't a vendor that they could pay to absorb their risk, or at least mitigate the risk. So understanding that risk is a shared accountability model. I'm buying some software from you. I need to follow your best practices to implement this thing to have a hopefully predictable result. I apply your patches as they come out from time to time. I address 0-day patches on the day, etc. So in this type of regulated industry, we had a ban on open source software that we had to respect purely because there was no one to carry the can of risk. So how do we deal with that when there are, frankly, stunning open source products? And I want to call them products because someone's creating, right? But Robby, who owns the risk? If I can go to Kaspersky, Trend, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, I can give them money, right? And there is a commercial relationship that I can argue, I can hold them accountable for the quality of what they produce. And there's a risk mitigation in it. In a regulated industry,
if you're a US
space.
No, you cannot go to Kaspersky because Kaspersky is not allowed in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
So sorry that we're teasing you with this Russian thing, but
no, not at all. And so in a regulated industry, who carries the risk can from an open source point of view, and how do we deal with that as responsible adults when we want to use OpenSSL, for example, because it's baked into most operating systems that people don't know that it's there, right? So how do we deal with this, Robby?
So, Nick, I think that goes to sometimes the confusion that people have on how open source is developed and managed and distributed, etc. And I think I mentioned Red Hat previously. We've talked about other companies like SUSE and Canonical, and there's many others. But these are commercial companies that are offering a commercial product with the equivalent guarantees that you would get from other vendors. I also work with customers in highly regulated industries, and many of them are running their core, for example, ERP systems on top of, for example, SUSE or Red Hat, because these vendors have made sure to certify their products with the application that the customer needs to use. And yes, absolutely, that's critical to the customer, but to an extent, the application vendor is making sure that the back-end stack is actually suitable for the application. So, if SAP come along and say, or Oracle for that matter, if they come along and say, if you want to run our ERP software, you need to run this back-end stack, or these options are certified to run our application stack, then I think you as a customer should be well expecting to receive the same guarantees that you would for any other commercial software.
I would agree. And I don't think Red Hat Enterprise Server is a open source product at that stage. It's a commercial product that's being supported commercially.
No, it's still an open source product, and it's still bound by the open source licenses that apply to their product, be it GNU or Apache license, whatever the case may be. In fact, a product like RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, will comprise many open source licenses, and it's something that Red Hat themselves have to juggle in the back end. It's something that you don't have to worry about. But certainly, RHEL is still absolutely an open source product, and you can create an account on the Red Hat portal, and you can download Red Hat Enterprise Linux and use it for your own purposes. The commercial part of this typically comes in with the support aspect of what the company offers. So Red Hat are not actually charging for RHEL as a product. They are charging for the support, the maintenance, and the subscription services that they offer on the product. I know it's a very slight distinction, but it does still mean that the product itself is fully open source. I'll give a perfect example of how that works. CentOS has been a well-known, well-supported open source project for probably about 15 years. And I think it was just around the 2010 mark that Red Hat actually purchased the rights to the CentOS project. And they basically became the custodian. And that was a pure play open source project, no commercial attachments to it at all. But Red Hat used CentOS as a base to test the applications, the software, the services within the operating system, and build Red Hat Enterprise Linux from. So RHEL is based on CentOS. At the end of actually mid-2021, Red Hat decided to drop a bombshell, and it was a true bombshell, because CentOS was at that time used completely across the planet in all sorts of areas, from automotive to AI to web hosting, other internet services, etc. And basically, they said for CentOS version 8, whose support was supposed to end in 2029, they were expiring support for CentOS 8 in December of 2021, 6 months later after the announcement. It was an absolute bombshell. And the amount of commercial companies that make use of CentOS as a base for their commercial products is incredible. There's a lot of commercial companies that make use of it. You might be surprised. So the nature of this is that within a month, 2 different projects, Alma Linux and Rocky Linux, had sprung up. They created boards and trusts to manage those products, and within 2 months, both of them had RHEL equivalents out available. And Alma Linux, for example, at the moment is probably the primary replacement for CentOS. And that's a prime example of, if something doesn't work, or someone breaks the project, or they want to close down the project, or, whatever the case may be, someone else picks up the baton, carries on, and gives you an equivalent service or product.
It's a very interesting point, that, right? Because I was about to say before that story that if you were to use your normal sort of due diligence processes in selecting a software vendor for something, you would check for things like updates and the availability of updates and frequency of updates and that type of thing, right? And obviously, no one in their right mind would select a product that doesn't receive updates or can't be updated. So, you don't end up with the situation where you have, some thing that you're running your very important system on that doesn't, that has like OpenSSL 0.6 and has never been updated in the last 20 years, right? Because that's a problem. So if someone is using, going to select an open source product or a product that makes use of open source packages, provided the updates are being done and handled, and you would go through that whole process of making sure that that's all good. Now, how would you handle that as a business if you've gone through this due diligence process and you went, yep, we're going to deploy CentOS because, support until 2029, and then next minute, after you've deployed, your whole data center, all of a sudden now you've only got 6 months left. That would be a real, and I think that would be enough to put a lot of people off doing that again, because
Trust.
And Chris, I'll add there that personally, I would never recommend CentOS in a commercial enterprise environment as a core product. I would offer the client the commercial version of that. It's exactly the same product, but the commercial version of that via Red Hat. And the same goes for SUSE's products, Ubuntu's products. They've all got their sort of commercial versions of that, which is exactly the same product. It just comes with support that you pay for. So I think it's important, when it comes to SME and the enterprise, to acknowledge the importance and the criticality of the systems, hardware, software, whatever, the systems that enterprise runs, and the risks associated with anything that is operating within that environment. It's critical. And the fact that I've been an open source advocate for over 30 years means absolutely nothing. I gauge the requirement of the customer on a case-by-case basis, and I'm always going to err on the side of caution. So if it came to the option of running CentOS on Red Hat, I would, as a core product, I would suggest to the customer to run the commercial version, because you're going to get the support from Red Hat. And I have to say, if you've ever dealt with Red Hat support, it's a breath of fresh air. These guys, their technical support, the engineers know what they are doing. They are fantastic to deal with. So I would have no concerns recommending the commercial option in that case.
So last two questions for you, Robby, since we're coming up to the top of the show. The first one is, and it's a question and a comment. One of the things I've always respected about you is that you've got a breadth of knowledge in the knowledge domain that you apply open source to. So it doesn't matter if we're talking firewalls or endpoint protection. You've built clouds and hosted systems. You can talk about DR at great length, and all the way to the other side of the spectrum to VoIP. If someone is listening to this show and says, all right, I respect the fact that open source has got a place, but where do I start? And the question number two is, of course, since we're coming up to the top of the show, is what is it that you'd like to plug and make our listeners aware of?
Once again, and I don't think this is open source specific, but it is important. But I think the critical part of this is finding a partner to work with that has experience in this regard. It's really, really important. And as I said, I don't think it's open source specific. No matter the product set or the area that you're dealing with as an end user, you need to get partners who understand the class of product that you're looking at. So and I will mention as well that in smaller companies, it's not just the products that they need to look at, but it's also process and procedure. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit that smaller companies with smaller budgets can look at to improve their security and reduce their attack surface. But once again, it comes to the partner that you work with. You need to find a partner that can that understands your requirements, that understands the class of product or application, whatever the case may be, that you're looking at. And I think if you find that partner to work with and you work with them well, you're going to have a good experience. And then, yeah, to plug, I'll say I've been running my personal blog for probably about 15 years or so. There's hundreds of articles on there covering a breadth of areas and knowledge as well. As you said, I'm a bit of a know-it-all. But yeah, to be honest, there's a lot of useful information there, especially for SMEs, and also just people on their own who are looking for a little bit more sort of general information on IT security, etc. So we'll put the URL in the show notes after.
Yeah, no problem. We'll definitely make sure to do that. I think I skimmed through that the other day and I thought, wow, there's a lot of cool stuff on here that I need to get back to and read. So it's going to be just yet another open tab in my hundreds of open Safari tabs. But Robby, thank you very much for sort of sharing your knowledge with us and your passion for open source stuff. I think that was really interesting to me. It's quite funny. Not too long ago, I needed to do something, and I'm a Debian/Ubuntu guy. Whenever I need a Linux system, that's usually where I go. But I thought, let me try. I want to get back to messing around with CentOS, and I went looking for the CentOS project. And I was like, what the hell happened to CentOS? It's gone. Well, now I know what happened because I must have missed that.
So, well, Chris, if you're really looking for a challenge, I've been running Slackware since the mid-90s. Slackware Linux is actually one of the first open source Linux distributions that came out. It was actually called SLS in 1991 and then changed its name. That's going far back, 1991. Yeah. But if you're looking for a challenge, Slackware Linux.
Oh, geez. No, I'll be honest, I like macOS. It works nicely for me. I do have another machine on my desk here that has Parrot on it, which I mess around with as well. But anyway, maybe that's a story for another episode. Really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion with us. And yeah, we look forward to having you back again whenever you want.
Chris and Nicholas, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Robby.